here we're going to reflect on extended naturalism and its approach. Okay. So in the next year, I'm going to be making this case as loudly as I can. The academy has been defined by the hard problem of consciousness. At least the philosophy of mind into cognitive science, into neuroscience, has been claimed that there's a hard problem of consciousness and it's really difficult to solve, and people have won cases of wine in relationship to this. And it's actually not okay. It's not okay. We need to crack that assumption that there's a single problem. So my mission in the next year is to make this well known. Thanks, David Chandler, for all the hard work, but actually it's time to move beyond, and we need to instill the vocabulary of the neurocognitive engineering problem. That's one set, which is more or less the real problem of mind 2, and Neil Sess points to this, and we can put to it on a diagram and say, how the heck does mind 1A, in the context of psychology, the non-conscious mental operations, neurocognitive operations, give rise to the felt experience of being inside of animals with complex active bodies and brains. That's one problem. And there is the Matt Segal noted this problem. Hey, how the hell do we put it all together in relationship to an understanding of subjects in a physical universe? How do we have a framework for what science is? And how does science know? Should science be a process structure? Should science a substance structure, etc.? And then how does actually we anchor that philosophical big picture view to what empirical science knows across the stack that allows us to clarify what we mean by psychology, or what cognitive science means by the mind? John Vervaeke and I will quickly tell you that psychology doesn't know its identity and cognitive science doesn't know what it means by the mind. If that is the case, then the entire architecture of the hard problem is blown up, because it argues that mental processes causing behavior is scientifically understood in one nice, neat package of mechanistic causation. That's what physicalism argues, and then you can't get phenomenology. That's the whole easy versus hard problem. So that the easy problems attached to science, the hard problems are supported out, but we're looking at the easy problems, which is science of mind as mental process and behavior, and I'm here to tell you that actually makes no sense. So if that doesn't make sense, then there's a larger problem that Chalmers overlooked. Okay? Or put it differently, he basically says we're going to take the mechanistic view, say that this is what is organized, and then from there this kind of makes sense, and that's what's easy. And I'm saying actually no, it doesn't make sense. That's a mistake. So actually those easy problems aren't so easy. And in fact, he even points to it when he works with Clark and says, hey, there's an extended mind problem. It's like when we take cognitive psychology and go, actually, the mind's just inside the brain, and then it produces behavior as a control system. Actually, no, when we take a systemic view, we actually need to think about the mind as a complex adaptive system, and it's constantly interfacing with higher order structures in the world, and that extended mind, like grocery lists, is where he starts with Clark, and says, actually, we really can't reduce it just to the information processing. Yeah, no doubt. There's a complex adaptive system that we've been missing, mind animal, plane of existence, characterized by the property of mindedness. And because we've been mind blind, we haven't had a good frame of reference, and the grammar of our gripping the world has been confused. So that's the structure, that's the argument. I think it's quite tight, and I think it's time for us to kind of really coalesce around this and see if my argument, or this argument from Ian, holds. So yesterday, John did a wonderful job. I look forward to talking to him more about it. I had not read, I'd sent him this. I saw it. Somebody posted Hull's updated version. I was excited about it, but I was focused on other things. John's argument enables us a deeper articulation of the conformist argument that we've been making that really started extended naturalism, which would need to change the nature of nature, the way we conceptualize the natural world, and change the way we conceptualize consciousness with the argument that there's a conforming view between the transcendent ground of intelligibility and the transcendental intelligences that would afford that capacity, and then in the more common sense world, hey, the world evolved, and we're evolved to perceive it based on the way we evolved, and those two things should conform. Actually, in saying that, I'll make a little point about Donald Hoffman. It was like, hey, we didn't evolve to perceive reality, we evolved to perceive fitness. Be very careful about that, okay? That's like, okay, so I don't even know what he means really when unless he's arguing most people are naive realists. I don't know what he means when he says we just perceive reality. Nope, not too many people are naive realists. And virtually anybody from a modern psychological constructivist view would say, hey, yeah, we build schemas on the world. Where's the architecture of that schema come from? Loosely defined, from Piaget to Freud even, to everyone say, well, there's some evolved architecture that affords capacity for sense making. In other words, we're evolved to see the world through evolution, rather than see the world as it is. So that's a little trick that he plays that I would like to talk to him about at some point. But anyway, I digress. So extended naturalism gives us a system that I'm arguing resolves the Enlightenment gap, at least within naturalism. I see Rick there. It's like, hey, maybe this does nest itself in a larger structure that I'm agnostic about. And then something can come along and say, Henriques is full of shit, and here's what's missing, and now we have a better model. And of course, that could be nested in something else, right? It's elephants all the way down is what we can agree on. And I may well be missing an elephant, or up and down, right? It's elephants all the way up and down, and I'm at one level. So I'm advocating for UTOK. I often will say it's a theory for the back half of the 21st century. It is not, I'm not worried, unlike Bobby Azarian, I ain't worried about heat death. Okay? Heat death is billions upon billions of years away, and I don't think my theory has anything to do with heat death. It's a localized particular structure, like we all are, embedded in a sociocultural system building off of justifications that came before us, and justifications will come after us, and will show the tremendous limitations of my little mind relative to the universe. Okay? Once you have my mind, and then you can grow, and Bobby makes this point, and this I will support him on, is as long as we don't blow ourselves up, there's a potential for increasing complexification, and then systems will build upon systems. So my system would certainly be not, that's what I mean, I'm not foundationalist. I don't know the eye of God, and I do know that we screwed up in the Enlightenment. I know that. And I know really why we screwed up, and I know how to fix within that, because we're a bunch of little humans framing the world a particular way, and we're prone to limitations. And we can come off of limitations and grow, and then I have my limitations. Here's the basic model about how we're framing the Enlightenment gap. We're going to take a hierarchical predictive processing model, which goes all the way down through the nervous system, more or less, and we can take that and we can update it through John. And that's an unbelievably important thing. Recursive relevance realization creates an ecologically valuable, valid model of cognitive agents in the arena across a wide variety of different domains. It identifies the functionalist elements of the cognitive agent arena relation in a totally different way. It goes into a cognitive agent's cells. Here we are. This is the basic argument I laid out. We take hierarchical predictive processing, recursive relevance realization, and then place that in the map of the tree of knowledge. We then extract out mindedness, use that to map mind, take John's foundational insight which gives rise to a strong cognitive foundation that I can build off of and place behavioral investment theory and influence matrix and justification systems around it. Those are the three meta theories that come off of a unified theory of psychology. And then boom, you have an architecture. And I argue that architecture then can box in the neurocognitive engineering problem and thus resolve, and also do so in a way that clarifies the nature of human consciousness in a way that resolves the obvious gaps that come off the Enlightenment. What does it mean about where we are in terms of our knowledge? It means that it comes with a new definitional system of mind and consciousness. We have been completely conflating these terms, confusing these terms. We don't know what these terms mean and how they're related. And UTOK says, hey, consciousness should be the concept that refers to the functional properties of awareness and responsivity in its broadest sense. And then that can all the way go down to a process philosophy, or lots of different kind of notions about functional awareness and responsivity we can wonder about. But functional awareness and responsivity is fundamentally different than what we mean as humans when we introspect and experience the world in what we would experience as mind too, but the properties of which are the subjective qualitative experience of being in the world. A quality that we perceive as a subject. Okay, that's the description that's nested in our mindedness. Now we can say, and then when it's really nested in the mindedness, we should use mindedness terms. When we abstract it and wonder whether or not this could exist in other contexts, the subjective quality experience of being, then we need to put that in that context and use consciousness too as that. But when we're talking about humans and animals, It's now mind too. Mind too is the subjective conscious experience of being. So when David Chalmers says he's a search of a fundamental theory of the conscious mind, he actually means he's a search in a fundamental theory of mind too. Or is it in search of consciousness too in the potentiality of consciousness too in the universe? That would be a different set of questions, because one set of consciousness nests itself inside of brains and complex active bodies, nests itself inside of mindedness. Others just extracts the functional properties and says, where would this live? Could it live in artificial intelligence? Could it live in different life forms, et cetera, et cetera? Once you take the structure out, what does it look like? Well, the consciousness at least references the structure. Mindedness then binds it. Okay, what does life look like without cells and genes? Good question. Good question. Mindedness says, well, we got to bind this. Conscious mind in animals and humans looks a particular way. It's nested in a structure that we call complex active bodies and brains. And it evolved in a way. Okay? And even more important for me, in my view, as in psychology, psychotherapy, and what we're talking about and the reference that we're using, I want to be clear, we're talking about humans first. And this is not, for the love of God, this is not to eliminate consciousness in other animals by any stretch. But it is for the love of God to be clear that our little version of consciousness, okay, is nested in primates that talk. And that's a very important element at multiple levels. One, we're a particular kind of species. Of course, what is it like to be a bat? Makes this point. What's it like to be a dung beetle? We still don't know. This is the hard problem. The neurocognitive engineering does have key aspects that are very hard still, and lots of interesting questions arise. But fundamentally, what I am saying is, hey, when we're talking, we need human consciousness to be framed first, see what we're extending off of that. And what this theory framework, extended naturalism, especially grounded in UTOK here, is there's a dynamic relationship between mind 2 and mind 3. We need mind 3 to understand human consciousness. I stumbled into the theory of mind 3 in 1996 with justification systems theory. And it's absolutely crucial then we're talking about human consciousness that mind 3 is part of the equation. And we start there as our reference for what it is that we're talking about. And the definitional system then is ground into map of mind, which identifies the 3 layers. Mind 1, a mindedness that doesn't have subjective conscious experience. Mind 2, which is a higher order neurocognitive process that emerges out of it as a virtual reality modeled by a plasma ball. And then mind 3 in humans as a talking narrative that can be inside or out, but that propositional network goes right through the skin without losing its form. Okay? So we then can home in on mind 2, and we are arguing through the bridges between John and I. We can now specify this as an epistemic portal, specifically a perspectival, to use John's theory or taxonomy of forms, a perspectival epistemic portal. This perspectival epistemic portal is consistent with an evolutionary 2-step model, whereby sort of early animals begin the development of sentience through feeling systems that bind exterior senses to interior motivational states to emotional responses. Okay? And you get broadcast functions that tie sensation to response, and pain is a great example of this. So pain is a broadcast function that coordinates a signal that binds a particular state, say body damage, to a particular response, say avoidance. Okay? And the argument is that we can then have basically the form of qualia in the form of pain, which is then essentially an integrated informational state that can then activate and broadcast. That's part 1. But then part 2 is once you get thinking animals, you get a cortex. The cortex grows out of the structure, and you get a back of the brain cortex that's pulling up qualia, organizing them in an integrated informational state that they can be manipulated and worked through a frontal lobe that has attentional structures and memory structures, and ultimately a system of a self that's deciding what it is that's relevant across time. Okay, and this is a non-reflective self or non-explicitly reflective self in mammals, and certainly we can see this in terms of the mirror self-recognition task. And we can talk to Bonnie about horses, and actually they have a sense of themselves that we are probably really blind to. But they don't have, well, at least we can, certainly the propositional language and narrating self is yet another layer on top of that, that then creates us as talking apes and with cultured person plane of existence capacities. The model of an epistemic portal is consistent then with a core back front, which is very consistent with the architecture. And we can think about this as sort of the brain-skin relationship inside out, which I think is a kind of cool, creepy thing sometimes, but basically you have the brain, and it starts off essentially as a skin structure that goes one way outside and then goes in. And then philosophically, we can shift this from an epistemological perspective, say perspectival knowing, that we find in the world, interestingly enough, is perspectively grounded. Like, you have to have a subject, you're inside, you can't introspect and see your brain, and we can't, from the outside, look into you and see your first-person experience of being. Other knowledge systems are not like this. Other knowledge systems, procedural knowledge systems, they deploy themselves in the agent-arena relationship itself. Propositional knowledge systems are not like this, but perspectival knowledge systems are bound within the subject. And this gives us at least a frame for understanding why the epistemic problem of consciousness is located in this, and this becomes even clearer when we bring in the history of natural science and Galileo and him splitting the world into primary and secondary qualities. The model that we're offering is very consistent with cognitive psychology. This gets back to Shushrif's point. Cognitive psychology is, and we need cognitive science, cognitive psychology, any theory of human consciousness at least, that's going to deal with the neurocognitive engineering problem into human phenomenology needs to look at the experimental data in relationship to that. I'm going to say a little bit about that today if the time allows itself. And I made the point, and I can make this a lot more detail. We can take the major theories. This is Seth and Bain in 2022 said the four major classes of theories that were exciting in the empirical literature were higher order theories, recurrent predictive processing theories, IIT, and global neural workspace. Those are the four big ones, I would argue. And I can assimilate and integrate the key ideas from each of those with this epistemic portal view and put them in dancing relationship to each other in a way that says, no, they're not in competition. Certainly they may say specific things that are interesting, but they're that are compete, and we can engage in a collaborative, antagonistic, experimental. But let's get the big picture first. Let's take mind two. We're talking about not consciousness, mind two in mostly humans. And we're asking it, like, what is the system? How is it made up of conscious contents at one level? Where do they come from? How is a self that's perceiving, has access to them, manipulates them in a global? Do we have a whole picture? And if we're using consciousness, then maybe not. Okay. So here's the epistemic portal view, and the plasma ball, the core, and then the flashes are particular conscious contents that could come under attention, and then you put your attention on it as though you're touching it. This was the point I didn't have time to make last time, but I'll make briefly here, and that is all of this is nested inside of a theory of mind one. I alluded to it, and this mind one theory relates to the... Okay, we can. There's a question about mathematization. Let me finish this, and then maybe we can dialogue up until. So it's a theory of mind one. Okay, hierarchical predictive processing and recursive relevance realization. That then gets bound to behavioral investment theory. That's theory of mindedness. We have our map of this, puts it in the tree of knowledge, allows us to see it. What's hierarchical predictive processing interpreted by R plus behavioral investment theory? This is I reviewed this last time, basically starting with Carl Friston, down into the free energy principle, and then up in the sense where in relationship to recursive relevance realization for it's an ecologically valid view and one that's relatable to the first person perspective in human phenomenology. I pointed to this, but didn't talk too much about it. I am teaching a graduate class on cognitive psychology, cognitive science, and I'm reviewing the latest research on attention, memory, attention, and perception. And I'm going to basically consolidate 3 slides real fast, 3 classes in 3 slides. And again, just this is not to be understood, but really just to point to. So how do we understand memory? That's actually embedded in the architecture design. Is the 1967 model of memory still good? And that's there's input and there's a sensory register. Okay, and that sensory register then it can be held to say 1 to 3 seconds. That can be dropped into a short-term memory. It's essentially on the stage. That can be activated by a phenomenological loop in humans, which is the, not phenomenological, phonological loop, a language loop in humans, and a visual spatial sketchpad around an episodic buffer. That's called the Badley model of working memory. And then it can get stored in 3 different places: procedural memory, episodic memory, and semantic memory, broadly defined long term. That's all embedded in the structure. We can then shift over to attention and think about attention as sort of the resource glue that binds our cognitive structures together, filters certain things out that are less relevant, bumps certain things up that are more relevant, and then devotes processing resources to them up the recursive stack. That's essentially what attention is. It's a filtration mechanism. It's control versus automatic, online versus. There's a lot of interesting debate about exactly what the line is between attention and memory. Is working memory a kind of attention, et cetera, et cetera. Really good article that gave this detailed, rich view. And my whole point to the class is actually that detailed, rich view said there's control versus automatic distinctions. There's perceptual online attention distinction versus thought, not online, what they call non-perceptual, but basically imagination and attention to memory. And then there are things, events in the world, and goals and actions. Okay, and then attention is the resource glue that's filtering and binding the cognitive resources to afford tunneling that goes up, bottom up, and top down. That's control versus perceptual. Again, the point is, hey, here's a map of mind one that's taking functionalist models, easy problem models, and showing you how they're nested. But please note that although this is all a mind one model, they label episodic memories and semantic memories are called declarative. And what do they actually mean by that? Mind two. They mean mind two stuff. In other words, declarative memories are things that can be brought on conscious attention. And then in humans, then declarative memories are reported. And we can go from attention to perception. Perception is very closely related to the sensory register, and sensation is what comes in, although some people define sensation slightly differently, but we'll just say it's transduced. That means it goes across the neuro information processing system barrier, meaning there's something on the outside that gets measured, picked up, and translated, and then that gets sent up the stream. Perception is going to be, there's attentional filtering mechanisms there. And then perception is grounded into conception, where conception is the schematic structure, and it's a top-down, bottom-up processing structure. And we can see this is your basic cognitive constructivism. Richard Gregory is a well-known theorist in this domain. He gives us a framework for understanding about how, like the rabbit-duck illusion, you look at a rabbit one way, you look at a duck. The reason is you have conceptions of both ducks and rabbits. You have a bottom-up, the exact same stimulus, but the flashing between the two is the bottom-up, top-down. There's a lock and a key that's getting locked in relationship to that. But many theories of perception are like, hey, that's too static, that's too one line, that's too cognitive. We have the mindedness loop theories like perceptual control theory, ecological psychology, etc., from J.J. Gibson, and now more 4E cognitive science that actually, like, we need, and indeed, if you look at the structure of our recursive relevance realization, you'll know that actually the perception action loop is where the mindedness loop action's taking place. We need to be able to differentiate 4E cognitive perspectives, perception action loop perspective, from traditional cognitive psychology perspectives on perception. This is actually all embedded in the architecture of human mind diagram. So my point is that mind one, which then this is a nod back to Chalmers and say, yeah, actually we have made a lot of cumulative progress in relationship to mind one. We can consolidate that in an updated recursive relevance realization plus behavioral investment theory model. We can make distinctions between behaviorists, traditional cognitivists, connectivists, cyberneticists, and 4E cognitive scientist people in a clear view. And then we can box that in with a theory of mind three. I'm not going to talk too much about this, but UTOK gives us our frame of reference for what kind of primates are we. We're very relational primates. We look at Michael Tomasello and how we have shared intentional structures. And the influence matrix says what happened to us was we built a very flexible self-other relating map that afforded pre-verbal intersubjective coordination that allows us to do things like, and ultimately play music together, hunt together, do all sorts of hunter-gatherer pre-full-fledged narrative structures. We then symbolically tag things in the world, and then there's a tipping point of propositions. And the first key insight that ultimately gives rise to unified theory is just itself, justification systems theory, the idea that propositions are a tipping point. And ultimately, that propositional tipping point says, hey, on top of their mind one to mind two animal relational dimension is a propositional network structure that then gives rise, that's the experiential self. Then there's an emerging mind three egoic structure that then can be analyzed functionally in terms of, well, structurally in terms of propositions and functionally in terms of justification. And then we can map our map of mind. The ground of this is mind 1AB. Then there's an emerging experiential self, which we now have an epistemic portal model for. We have clear articulations of filtrations and dynamics between them. There's an egoic human person that's inside of us. That's the mind 3A private narrator versus, hey, Greg, I think that's a cool map. versus, shit, I don't really know if I get that map. Okay, that's a filtration dynamic. Or you could be authentic and say, and not have filtration. But the filters clarify the dynamic relationships between them. The result being that we then basically have a theory of mind 2 in humans that is now fully boxed in between a credible assimilative integrative theory of mind 1 and I think a novelly underappreciated theory of mind 3. And UTOK is here to say, if we're going to talk about human consciousness, we need all three minds, and we need to realize that if it's the subjective quality experience of being the human, we need to realize that we can box in mind 2 relative to mind 3. And so ultimately, then, another consolidated way of saying this is, hey, yep, extended naturalism gives a theory of mind 2 in a system that resolves the Enlightenment Gap. So that's a summary of the stuff that I offered last time. I wasn't sure in terms of, yesterday was a hell of a lot of fun. I want to do a shout out to the Rick session in particular. That warmed my heart. I look forward to hanging out with he and Brendan some more, and Layman's articulation, by the way, of Mind 3A in particular, and what it means about how to position ourselves as we go forward, was very congruent with what we're talking about in psychology, and that we hadn't talked with him about it at all. Was the convergent validity across different independent structures. Brendan's stuff about the point of value, and Rick's making a super important point, and it's so important because Bobby Azarian basically criticized, and I'm fine with criticism, but interpreted me as saying, oh, anything that's outside of my system is exo and not real. Exo is not real. That's not what I mean. Exo is, that's a different frame. I want to be within a coherent metaphysical system that then organizes this within the frameworks that we're operating from. It may be very incomplete. I'm totally open to that. The things like parapsychology open up fascinating questions, but the people themselves will say, well, we don't really know exactly how that would work mechanistically. So, okay, let's see. Let's follow that trail. I'm glad some people are, and maybe it will open up a radically new world of being in the world.